Well, I know it's a busy Thursday for everybody, so we'll go ahead and just get started on time here. Hi, everyone, and thanks for making it to our first in the summer series here at iComply on compliance topics and issues facing the industry. Today, we're tackling one that's really due in some precedent time here and unprecedented elsewhere in the industry as it relates to higher standards in general, as well as higher compliance requirements needed in the space, especially around testing and cultivation facilities specifically. Just to backtrack a little bit on the history and kind of know where we came from, Colorado is pretty advanced in its rules and regulations, and we could certainly see a lot of this being modeled from best practices through the Scientific Advisory Committee that advises the Marijuana Enforcement Division in the state. Over a number of years, as they're tackling cannabinoid issues and other things, they are also tackling some of the inconsistencies in testing as we relate to other similar fields. So in pharmaceuticals, for example, we talk about Schedule 3 coming up and the heavier standards that exist because of CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, GMP, GACP. This is also a lot of terminology that already exists in the international cannabis space. We're starting to see some of those recommendations come over to the MED through scientific advisors that understand the need for consistent cleanliness of products. We've also seen over the number of years people circumventing that process or perhaps submitting samples to the MED that aren't representative of the entire batch. And we've seen a number of recalls happening, increasing 300, 400% year after year of products that are no longer safe for consumption, according to MED. Not here to argue whether or not those limits on testing are right or wrong. They are what they are, and companies are expected to comply with that in order to keep clean cultivation facilities going. Initially, in the drafting of this process during rulemaking next year, we're about to go into another rulemaking this year. We've certainly participate in those every single year and try to keep our clients up to date on what's happening behind the scenes. But during that process, they took this from an ISO requirement, international standards, and over to a must hire third party. So really, even though there's a lot of compliance we're going to cover today regarding reduced testing allowance and what you need to do to keep in compliance with that as it relates to HACCP, its critical control points and critical limits and documentation surrounding all of it, just keep in mind this could have been a lot worse. In the 11th hour, they stripped a lot of that regulation requiring you to hire a third party, requiring a third party to do the audits, and are sort of trusting the industry to do this internally and to manage their reduced testing allowance program themselves. I think the other really important thing to sort of note here is that we're paying for increased scrutiny now. The MED for the first time is leveraging a fee for reduced testing allowance. In the past, it used to be called process validation, and you just had to test every so often according to the 4-week, the 6-week limit, whether it was a manufactured product or a cultivated product, and just keep those internal records of clean test results, and then you no longer have to test unless you made material changes to your SOPs. So while the framework for a lot of that still exists and reduced testing allowance goes that way, we now have an increased level of scrutiny where we'll actually be paying the Med $4,000 for a 12-month RTA period in which they can have extra dollars to essentially investigate and enforce whether or not you're doing the right thing. So I'm definitely suggesting to clients that you continue to test every harvest batch for contamination, every production batch, until you're ready with your SOPs in line, with everything squared away to go, in order to submit for that higher scrutiny process, which hopefully will pay for itself if you have to test less often than paying for a test on every batch. So this is an important incentive, and if we are going to go that route, it is optional. Then we'll talk about what is really needed to achieve reduced testing allowance as it relates to cultivations and specifically the new rules coming into effect July 1st around HACCP. I wanted to just share real quickly with everybody on the call as well. If you haven't already had a copy of our blog on this, we've done a decent job of trying to summarize for you what exactly is taking effect and how it will come into play. So I'll go ahead and post the link here in the chat. And you're welcome to take a look at this on your own terms, but we'll quickly review some of the key highlights as well that'll be coming with the changes in reduced testing allowance. So keep in mind that all regulated marijuana that you harvest during this 12-month period has to achieve and maintain this reduced testing allowance validation for contamination. You'll be paying that $4,000 fee. So within that 12-month time frame, you want to make sure that you don't have any new material changes to your standard operating procedures. That means changes in equipment, changes in chemicals, changes in process, anything that might impact or affect what we're going to refer to here as your critical control points or the actual SOPs themselves as it relates to the outcome or the output of the product and its quality. All of this has to do with that quality and that maintaining of that quality, that recording of that quality, and that assurance of that quality over time. Keep in mind that you are allowed to bring in new genetics now from other states even, or any other licensed facility or any 21 and up adult or badged employee. So you have the ability to bring in new genetics, but because we want to have this achieved for every single strain that we have in every single harvest batch being defined as the similar type of strain planted, treated, and harvested on the same days, that you may not want to include new genetics during this 12-month period of RTA. And you want to make sure that if you do implement new genetics, that you're not going to have to change your procedures, your chemicals, your equipment, or any other material changes. For our clients, we often suggest having an R&D SOP within the SOP. Maybe you want to try a small batch of product, you're going to test it, but you don't want it to necessarily be your everyday production batch. So having a research and development batch is really important to determining lights changes, chemical changes, nutrient changes, pesticide changes, anything else that you might want to do without implementing it across the organization and changing the fundamental way you operate and process marijuana. We want to make sure too that you have a good understanding of what HACCP means. It's a hazard analysis and critical control point system. This system has a lot of different moving parts, and it is defined with elements contained in ASTM standards D8250-19, or what's referred to as a standard practice for applying HACCP systems for cannabis consumable products. So with D37, with ASTM, with some of these international standard organizations, we've been working on what does this look like for quite some time. So I don't think it's any surprise that you're starting to see Colorado lead the way. We lead the way on a lot of different regulations. And I don't think it would be outside the realm of possibility or likelihood that you're going to see similar standards start to trickle down to different states over the next coming years. A lot of other states don't even do an RTA program. You have to just test every single batch. And so there's always the default of going to that. But if we want to incentivize better quality in the industry and better behavior, frankly, better systems and better processes, RTA is a really important measure of quality control in order to do that. And of course, it saves you money on not having to test every single time. You also want to make sure that you're adhering to cleaning equipment and maintaining equipment and cleaning up areas in accordance with your SOPs, and log that and record that documented information. Because part of this HACCP plan will be actually going back and validating that you've done those things in some sort of record log or maintenance log that you'll have regarding equipment and regarding cleaning of that equipment, tools, and other things that you use. So part of this initial process means defining critical control points. And in the regulations, there's actually a list of the HACCP team and their experience that you need to have. There's a list of your products and description and intended use for each product that you'll be making that'll be achieving RTA. There's a process flow diagram. This is an example of one that we've developed for clients in the past, where green indicates kind of where product moves. Red might indicate some sort of measure of management, or perhaps taking some sort of recordation. Yellow might be more of an HR function. But it's a good idea to have a visual about how you operate. Not only is this a helpful training mechanism for new employees, but it's also a great reference document internally, and helps you really define what those critical control points are. So critical control points in this case might be with new genetic material, right? Making sure that we have genetics that are stable, making sure we vetted the genetic providers, that we've recorded everything we need to from a compliance standpoint, but then also managing it from a quality standpoint. How are those genetics treated? Are we pulling from mothers? Are we using tissue culture? How are we essentially ensuring quality around that? And is there a critical control point there? I think what's really interesting is how the MED just recently sent out some guidance. And in that guidance document, they're using an internal quality checklist, which really just covers the rules, but doesn't go into a lot of depth and definition about what critical control points really are in the process. So the rules themselves say one thing, the MED says another, and then there's the standards themselves and how to actually achieve this RTA. So it's important to kind of define what that process flow diagram looks like and what those critical control points are. You also want to make sure that you're looking for chemical and physical hazards and biological hazards at those critical control points. so that you have some sort of measurement of what the critical limit is. And the critical limit comes into play and is important when you conduct the audit of each of those critical control points. So if you're applying pesticides, if you're applying nutrients, if you're storing nutrients, how do we have processes in place that ensure safe and adequate storage, safe and clean hand washing facilities, tool equipment processes in place that you're cleaning tools between each batch, that sort of thing. Because that'll lead to what we consider a hazard analysis of those identified critical control points. And in that hazard analysis, you'll be listing the critical control points as well as reasoning out how you identified that as a critical control point. And these are just areas in which you're measuring and managing quality to ensure consistent outcomes of the product. And within each of those, you'll define a critical limit and provide the reasoning in your documentation for your HACCP system on how you achieved determining that critical limit and how you selected it. You also have monitoring procedures for each of those critical control points. Ideally, those are written into your SOPs. It may be a team lead function, a management function, but some sort of way to identify how you monitor the critical control points themselves. And we're going to talk a little bit about CAPA plans. This is included in the internal audit checklist that the MED sends over. And in our experience, a lot of people don't really understand what a CAPA plan is. It is a process or a series of processes and procedures in which you correct deviations. So you've got to identify what the deviation is, where it could happen, and how do you take corrective action and preventative action, CAPA, in order to make sure that you don't deviate from quality, in a lot of cases from compliance. You want to list out your verification procedures. They're also going to require a HACCP system summary page that includes a list of those CCPs, the critical limits, your monitoring procedures, corrective actions that you might take for verification procedures, as well as record titles with the CCP activities. So water activity monitoring, for example, or pesticide application. And you're going to have any support documentation as well that applies to that that'll have to be kept as part of your mandatory record keeping. So as we talk about HACCP, it's much more than the simple checklist that the MED sent over. This is an internal audit checklist that they probably want you to have if they're sending it to you. They said you may use it in lieu of having your own, but this is probably going to go into addition to your own internal idea of what your audit checklist should look like in order to achieve that reduced testing allowance. So as you look at different critical control points, you have in here really just a copy and paste of the regulations, but you'll find that a lot of these regulations relate to quality. Have your floors been constructed in a manner that they're adequately cleaned and they're kept in good repair? A lot of grows out there may still have 2x4s and drywall instead of maybe the adequate materials that continue to cause contamination issues, especially 12 years down the line, 13, 14 years down the line after starting up their original cultivation. Is there adequate lighting? Is there where the equipment or utensils are cleaned? If you can't see what you're cleaning, you may not be able to clean it. Do you have preventative pests outside of just the plants on the outside of the building? Do you dispose of your rubbish on a regular manner so you're not creating a harboring place for pests to gather? Are there any building fixtures that need to be cleaned on a regular basis, or do you have areas that are swampy that might lead to microbial growth? So anytime we have to come in and find a point of failure, these are the types of things we're looking for as well. And it's a bit of investigative work to determine where potential sources of contamination could come from that end up cross-contaminating product that otherwise would have been produced cleanly. So it's important to follow these checklist items and to go through and to determine really a scoring system on your internal audit that'll be required as part of your ongoing compliance and managing these internal audit scores and checklists as part of your identified CCPs and CLs. So to sort of summarize what we mean by that is you can use this guidance document, but it's not going to be in great detail. The tool is only as good as the person using it, and you can hand somebody a hammer and potentially they could build a house, but more than likely they're going to need a lot more than just a hammer and some nails to do so. So this is a tool, one of many that may be needed to really set up the right quality management system at your operation. As you're going through and identifying those critical limits, you're measuring to say, is that a minor nonconformance when I find it? Is there no nonconformance and everything's in perfect order? Or is there a major nonconformance that would deduct 5% from this? Or is there a critical failure where the system is not working, nothing is controlled, and we 100% fail that? Because this scoring system will identify for you and for the regulators who will look at these documents the general conformity that you have to your identified process flow diagram, critical control points, and your critical limits. If you have minor deficiencies, it means it could lead to a risk in product safety. Major means that it has a high to definite risk to product safety. And critical means that you are literally leading people into potential injury or death, or falsifying records, or doing something that would cause a complete failure. And those scores will determine whether or not you pass or fail. And in order to continue with that particular system, you have to have a passing score of at least 80%. So as you go through and you sort of identify this, they've given everybody a simple checklist to use on the side here. And again, a lot of this is a lot to do with regulations. But I highly suggest you go through this and all 14 pages, conduct this audit now, at least as a self-assessment, and identify any problem areas that you might have before you submit for your reduced testing allowance program. If you do find deficiencies and find that you need some additional help, we're here for you at iComply and can certainly come in and look at those particular issues and then drill down even further on some of these questions to find out where the deficiencies are and to make sure that we set up good systems and processes in order to do so. We mentioned SOPs earlier. A lot of the standard operating procedures out there in the industry need to be brought up to speed like yesterday. So many people are still using old SOPs that sit on a shelf gathering dust and are not up to date, let alone in any sort of format that can be used to train and develop people or to run their business by. It's a huge deficiency, and anybody that's still operating that way is not going to be ready for reduced testing allowance for a long time. But if there's a few things that need to be fixed in the SOPs or that are out of date, or you'd like us to just conduct a standard operating procedure review to let you know where the deficiencies are, that's the kind of work we do, is to go in and compare it to your actual operations and say, look, this rule changed, you did change this SOP. Or to achieve reduced testing allowance, we really need to look at these other areas for quality or inventory control, for example. Everybody runs their business a different way, and there's a million ways to grow cannabis, but there's only very few ways to do it in a compliant manner. So with regard to this, I think the important part to really pay attention to here is on page 9, as it relates to the contamination testing program and achieving reduced testing allowance. Do you have records from before this? Because we've been operating since January this year till now, until July. Are they in compliance with your RTA standards already? Have you made any material changes? And then do you have those HACCP plans in place? And it's going to walk you through kind of what that looks like from the MED's checklist standpoint. So again, for me, this looks much more like a regulator's checklist that they might use for auditing you. But maybe you can use this in conjunction with your own sort of process flow map, process flow diagram, critical control points you identify, and critical limits to really get down to what it looks like in setting up your own HACCP plan that can be used to successfully navigate all of these nuances and reduce testing allowance, and really what's happening in the higher standards that are being set for cultivators. And I think it's not unreasonable to say if we're seeing this now in cultivation, we're likely going to see this probably coming to manufacturing near you with things like GMP standards. There are systems out there, such as quality management systems like iSolicity, that is custom tailored for the industry on verifying and tracking batches and measuring quality input on a critical control point for ingredients, for example, to make sure they meet standard. And doing everything we can within our operations, not just to produce a lot of product in quantity, but to produce a quality product as well. So I think it's really important to pay attention to, and I think it's really important to understand that this could be the first in a many series of dominoes that are coming to other states, especially if we look at things like Schedule 3. Schedule 3 falls underneath some well-established programs, things like FDA's guidance to cultivating botanical medicines, and things like the CFR standards, Code of Federal Regulation under CFR 21, as well as some other standards that are being integrated slowly into this long process of D37 for ASTM, for example. But we don't have any botanical medicines that have been approved to date for medical use in the United States by the FDA in any way, shape, or form. Even the pharmaceutical options that are out there are synthetically derived THC, some level of CBD, and have been approved through FDA through the use of clinical trials. So people that have a medical marijuana license in the state of Colorado, for example, may be able to get some exemption from 280E right away. And that's sort of the biggest advantage we're seeing coming out of this with the most immediate effect, as we hopefully see this before Biden either stays or leaves office in this next term. But what we're really starting to see is the need for more clinical data, and of course, hopefully, the idea that we have a descheduling along the way for true interstate commerce. Otherwise, the only interstate commerce that would be able to be allowed would be the ones that meet these very high standards and are providing cannabis for clinical research. There's a handful of university grows, for example, that have been set up in order to be able to do that. And certainly any of us can anticipate that if this goes to Schedule 3, Big Pharma won't hesitate to try and replicate that success without the fear of Schedule 1 looming over them. So I think we could see a lot more botanical medicines. I think we could see a lot more derivatives of cannabis. If we look at Israel and what they've done in their pharmaceutical program, there are ratios of cannabinoids from THC to CBD, let alone any of the other number of cannabinoids that are really designed to treat specific symptoms, specific illnesses, and specific patients. And if we do see that, then we would see a pharmaceutical recommendation, just like a doctor would. We'd see commercials on TV telling people to ask their doctor about it for particular conditions. And you would see cannabis move in a completely different direction, where you'd have patents around formulations and different products that the industry, frankly, isn't prepared for. But certainly nothing would stop that activity from going interstate, or those cultivators who meet those standards from growing for those folks. So it's a tremendous new opportunity that I think really does fall in alignment with what we're seeing here coming out of Colorado and the MED Scientific Advisory Board, and the huge conversation around quality management in the industry. I think we're starting to see sort of the final collapse of what we have been looking at as quality, which is really just sticking your nose in a bag and smelling it and going, yeah, man, that smells great. Certainly that is a factor of subjective quality, but we're starting to see, I think, a lot more stringent standards to ensuring consistent quality is produced over and over again. There's a reason why Coca-Cola tastes the same every time it's produced, despite millions of batches of its products. So this is kind of where these things are going. These are sort of the requirements that are going to be necessary. And we understand that for most people, we're not operating at the level of budgets and technology and resources that a pharmaceutical company would be. I think it's really important to know that. And having been in business for going on 13 years here, 14 years here, we understand all too well what it's like to be in the shoes of the average operator. Having said that, it's still possible to sort of dial this down. And one of our superpowers is taking this large, complicated, complex issues and breaking them down into actionable items and understanding exactly what our folks with maybe a bachelor's degree or a high school diploma are going to need in order to consistently produce product in a way that still documents it, still manages it appropriately from a compliance perspective, and can help businesses save money by investing into RTA. The more people we can get to, the more people we can get to manage our SOPs correctly, the more legitimacy we create in the industry, and the more consistency we'll have, which only drives up brand value. So if we look at this as just woe and gloom, more compliance, more rules, I understand the frustration there all too well. It doesn't seem like the rule book gets any smaller, but these things are manageable. I think it's really important to understand and have a good game plan, a good team. We love working with our clients to really dial down on what does that need to look like for my business, and how do I implement this in the way that those goals can be achieved in the next 30, 60, or 90 days. I want to thank you all for your time today, and thank you for choosing iComply to talk about this in our first of the summer series. Next up, we'll be talking a little bit about when things go wrong, and talking to operators that have had regulatory issues and have gotten in trouble with the MED to see what they did, how they resolved it, and otherwise how to avoid those same mistakes in the future. So we appreciate you joining us today, and thank you all for your afternoon and your time